Here we're going to talk SAT reading, and we're going to break down 3 simple tips that can drastically improve your score and hopefully help you stop feeling so frustrated and so overwhelmed with the SAT reading test. If you currently feel like it's the most unfair test you've ever dealt with, you keep trying a bunch of different strategies and nothing seems to work for you, hopefully we're going to make you feel a lot more comfortable and you're going to actually start to see improvement and also understand the third tip, which we're going to go through, is how you can actually improve on your own, how we can really do that and help you progress as you're going through. Now, the first thing, and this is by far the most important thing that you have to figure out for the SAT reading, is what method, what strategy should I be approaching with for the passage overall. Now, there's a handful of different ways I teach this, but what we're going to cover is the one way that works best for 75-80% of the students I work with, particularly for the students who are not really naturally gifted strong readers. Now, the one thing you want to keep in mind with the SAT reading is there is no one perfect strategy, as I said. So if you keep trying a bunch of different strategies, you're never going to end up improving and you're going to be stuck in the same spot, which is being super frustrated and overwhelmed. But what we're going to do is what I call chunking and labeling. Now, the goal of this is to make the SAT passage as simple and straightforward and digestible for us, and especially if you're someone who finds yourself reading the entire passage and when you get to the second half of the passage, you kind of start to forget what happened in the first half. Well, this reading then really isn't super helpful for us if we get there and we have no idea what we were supposed to actually be remembering. Now, what we're first going to do is we're going to look at each of the questions and note any questions that are line or paragraph related. We're going to skip over these kind of two-part ones that we see here. We'll talk about these a little bit later on. But once I've noted each of these questions that are lined and paragraph related, what I'm pretty simply going to do is go back and write down the question number next to those corresponding lines or paragraphs. So I'd put a 30 next to 63, a 31 next to 72, a 29 next to 73. So as we go back through, what we now can do is we can have our 29 here, we can have our 30 over here. We'll make sure I didn't miss any of the lines. That should actually be 31. So that will be 31, and then we'll place the 30 next to 63. We're going to do the same thing for both questions 26 and questions 23. So now what we have is we have a little bit of a map of exactly where our evidence is going to be for those questions. And now once we're done with this, now we're going to start chunking. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to read this first, and I'd go all the way through. Generally speaking, I always recommend students start off with going through in thirds. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read that first third, and as I read through that first third, I'm going to stop and answer this question. When I've read the context that I need for the question, I'd answer 23. I'd continue on, I'd answer 30. Now, we're going to talk about coming back to these at the very end, but we'll talk about one little pro tip there as well. But once I've answered those questions, I may be able to answer a question like 24 and 25 after reading that initial context as well, because I've just read those first 30 lines, so I should be able to just read a little bit further, and then I'm going to be able to go back and answer these two questions. We're going to work through one of these together in a second, but once I've read through that first chunk, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to read through this next chunk, and what we see here is in our next chunk, we don't have any of those lined questions, so I'm just going to read the entire chunk. And once I'm done reading this portion, what I would then just do is I'd look and see if there's any questions that I know I can answer based off that. And I may be able to go through and I may be able to answer these two questions together based off of that, but I don't see any other questions that I could be answering. So all I would do now is I would read that last chunk, and then I'm going to be able to answer questions 29, 31, and 30. Now, we are always going to want to save these big main purpose, main idea questions for last, because after we reread a lot of the text for our smaller questions, it's going to be far easier for us to identify our right versus wrong answer choices. Now we're going to talk about these paired evidence questions. So these are going to make up 27 to 35% of your reading questions on the SAT, which means they can be pretty anxiety driving because they can make such a humongous impact in your score, either for the positive or negatively. Now, what we actually want to do is we want to take advantage of the fact that the SAT is letting us know where the evidence is going to be to this previous question. What we can see is we know for a fact that the answer to question 24 is going to be contained in one of these lines, So we can just use the two questions together for us to be able to go through and find our correct answer. Because what we can really think about to find our right answer is our correct evidence is going to be doing two things. One, it's going to be properly answering the question above. And the second thing is we're going to be able to look back at these answer choices and we're going to have an answer choice that is either demonstrated if it's an inference question, or more so rephrased or restatement if it's a clear evidence, what we call clear evidence, where you don't see an inference keyword there, which is going to really let you identify if these are right, and you get to use the two questions together to help you do so. So strongly encourage you to pause the video, see if you can figure out which one's right, but we're going to run through our correct answer here and then talk about how the others are wrong as well. So one last thing you always want to do is you always want to make sure you're reading the sentence before each of these lines, because often that context is going to be really helpful. Not going to happen every single question, but you'll see a lot of questions you wouldn't be able to identify the right answer without reading that preceding sentence. So first thing I want to do is I want to break down the question. Now as I break down the question, I want to understand what type of evidence I'm looking for. Is it going to be clear evidence or a restatement? And since I see clear evidence, or is it going to be like demonstration via an inference question? Because I see what can reasonably be inferred about the reason Usher wouldn't use northern bald ibises as the subject of the study, there's a very good chance this is going to be a more difficult question, and the evidence is going to demonstrate one of these answer choices rather than explicitly state it. So I need to be more careful with the context. I need to be more careful with how deeply I'm reading. So we'll go through lines by lines, and I'd always read the preceding sentence here. So I'd read this whole first paragraph. Anyone watching the autumn sky knows that migrating birds fly in a V formation, but scientists have long debated why. A new study of ibises finds that these big-winged birds carefully position their wingtips and sink their flapping presumably to catch the preceding bird's updraft and save energy during the flight. Well, the question that I'm being asked here is, what can reasonably be inferred about the reason Usher would use northern bald ibises as the subject of the study? So I'm really looking for why he decided to use northern bald ibises in his study. This has nothing about why he decided to use that. We haven't even talked about Usher would yet in this passage. So that lets me get rid of A quite easily. Now, 10 to 12, we can kind of use the same thing here. We have not seen Usher would discussed at all, so there's no way we could basically have a reason for why he's using them in his study. But we'll still go through these lines and we'll still talk about how we can find it's wrong. There are two reasons birds might fly in a V formation. It may make the flight easier, or they're simply following the leader. Squadrons of planes can save fuel by flying in a V formation, and many scientists suspect that migrating birds do the same. Maybe this could give us a reason, but we get to validate it back up by here. A has nothing to do with that. B has nothing to do with that. We'll see. This is how the SAT likes to construct a lot of wrong answers. Some keywords are in there. You see airplane. You're like, oh my God, we were talking about airplanes over here. But we are not talking about the ibises having a body design that is similar to that of a modern airplane. We're saying groups of them fly similar to groups of airplanes. So we can eliminate this and we can eliminate B. Now we'll jump down to 22 to 24. Still want to read back through that preceding sentence here, but we'll just jump to the sentence alone. The study published in Nature took advantage of an existing project to reintroduce endangered northern bald ibises to Europe. Well, we already know we've started to talk about Usherwood right up here, and this is starting to tell us, right, this could be giving us a reason. They took advantage of an existing project. So now we get to look back up here and see if any of these answer choices make sense. Well, A would not match up with that, B would not match up with that, but D, especially because I know this is an inference question, would make sense. The ibises were easily accessible for Usherwood because they were taking advantage of an existing project. So this is one, I would kind of leave both of these as contenders. I'm not going to be 100% positive until I check my last group of lines. So we'll read our preceding sentence here. A flock of 14 juveniles carried data loggers specially built by Usherwood in his lab. The device's GPS determined each bird's flight position to within 30 centimeters. An accelerometer showed the timing of the wing flaps. Well, this has nothing to do with why he picked them. We're just describing what were the steps in the experiment, but we're looking for why, because we're looking for the reason he used them. So that's going to tell me that C and D must be correct here. So this using the two questions together lets you find your answers in a lot cleaner of a way. But remember, you have to make sure you're answering the question and you are able to validate your evidence by making sure if those lines are correct, it's answering the question and you have an answer choice in the previous question, which is either demonstrated from those lines or is going to be a restatement or a rephrasing of what you see in those lines. Now let's talk about improving on the SAT reading. Now, we're going to assume you have a pretty good understanding of everything, but one of the biggest mistakes that I see a lot of students make is they just go and they take entire practice SAT tests, or they're doing something far worse, which is using Princeton Review or Kaplan tests. You definitely should not be using those. There are a ton of free SATs, which are kind of linked below if you guys want to use those. But the big mistake is students just go and they take an entire reading test and they kind of grade it up a little bit and they get frustrated with their score and then they just go on and they take another reading test. They expect that they're magically going to improve on the reading section without really examining their mistakes. Now what we instead want to do is we want to create a really quick feedback loop for you to figure out what works and what doesn't work and give you the opportunity to quickly implement some changes from what you've learned. So instead of going through and taking full SAT reading sections, what I instead want you to do is take a reading passage. Put 13 minutes on the clock, go through the passage, grade it up, really critically examine your mistakes. Did you not pick up keywords in a question? Did you do a question out of the easiest order? Were you not using a preceding line in one of those two-part paired evidence questions? Did you pick a pair of evidence that looked right but wasn't actually answering the question? After you grade it up and you identify what you got wrong, you really want to critically examine why you got the questions wrong, what you might have done if you had any time issues, and write yourself some notes. And once you've written down what you got wrong, think a little bit about things you want to try to improve, and then go and take another reading passage. And once we do this, if you go through 5 passages where you're really critically examining your mistakes and you're making little improvements and you're trying new things, they're not always going to work, but it's going to give you a really quick feedback loop so you can figure out what works and doesn't work. After you go through 5 passages there, you are going to be improving so much quicker than you will if you just go and take 3, 4, 5 reading tests, but you're not really critically examining your mistakes. That is the most important part for improving on the reading, and it really goes for improving on any other part of the SAT as well. Now, if you do want to check out a little bit more, I do have an SAT reading course, which is around 9 hours of video and explanations. And you can also check a free trial out, that is below. But otherwise, I really hope this video helped you guys out. Please like and subscribe and comment if you guys have any questions or if there's any other type of content you'd like to see.